Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler. I'm here with Susan Cato. And today we have the distinct pleasure of speaking to Oren Schneider. Oren is the author of this fascinating Holocaust memoir called the Apprentice of Buchenwald. So I have it right here. Um, Oren, I mean, number one, I wish we had more time to just chat because my family is actually from Bratislava as well, and I have so many
Wow,
questions.
that's incredible. What a small
Yeah,
world.
it is a really small world, but that's for another day. Welcome, Oren, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you, Leah. Nice to meet you, Susan. Happy to be here.
Great.
I mean, let's just get right into it. I mean, so tell us a little bit. I mean, I don't want to give it too much away, so tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to interview your grandfather.
Wow. So, first, the last few weeks have been incredible in the sense that a story that was so intimate and so private for so many decades is now out there, and so many people are reaching out. I mean, sharing their feelings, sharing their thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm not an author, I wrote a book, but
You,
I'm a
but you, so
businessman
you're an
and an
author now.
entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Yes, and sort of this was my COVID project, one that
Mm-hmm.
I was committed to do for many, many decades, but never had the time, never had the
Mhm.
opportunity. But then COVID came. Um, so, so to me, this is very new and very exciting and very unique. It's a place I never thought I'd find myself in. Having a
Mm-hmm.
discussion here today with you. Um, my grandfather sort of raised me from a very, very young age. I lost my father at a very young age. He was a very special man. We lost him around the beginning of COVID. And he was the survivor, the ultimate survivor for his entire life. And he went through the adventures and the unique challenges as described in the book. And he felt that it was appropriate to share them with me since I was very, very young, and sparing no detail, sparing no description. And I grew up thinking or knowing that this was life.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was a surviving family, and everyone was raised or was surrounded by survivors. And when I was starting to tell my friends at school and growing up in Israel, it was shocking to me to learn that it wasn't that common, and that sort of the adventures and the stories that I was raised on were not as common, and people were excited and very interested in hearing about these stories. So at a very young age, again, uninstructed, I started recording him on analog devices and other
Mhm.
gadgets. He was crazy about gadgets. He was traveling the world. He was coming back from Japan with all sorts of new recording devices. I used them to record him. With time, I became more techie and sort of pursuing that. And in the last part of the 90s, we actually sat down and did this properly. I also sat down with his mother, was very old at the time, over 100, and they
Mhm.
had incredible stories. They were highly educated. They spoke many, many languages. They went through all these experiences. They had incredible perspectives. And I was sitting on this treasure trove. And then I moved to the States around 2004 and started working with genealogy platforms, especially with my heritage. A friend of mine from the military started that company, and I started using the platform to learn more beyond what I've learned from my grandfather and his mom and his father about our family and the origins of everything, and why we were so small. And I mean, the smallest family
Mhm.
you can imagine. Where were
Yeah.
all the others? Were they all lost in the Holocaust? And he said, well, not really. Many of them went to the States before the war. Again, growing up in Israel, there's a clear indoctrination when you're at
Yeah.
1948, a small nation of 600,000, surrounded by hundreds of millions, um, in conflict. Then you basically need to explain to everyone that this is the place you have to fight for it. Only later, when you become an adult, you understand that there's not one way to live a Jewish life or live within a Jewish community. But growing up, we knew very little about Jewish communities outside of Israel. But coming here, rekindling old connections, um, researching and finding a lot of the great uncles and their families that have left the small town in Slovakia before the war. My great grandfather was the last of the male siblings to stay there. All the rest left to the states
Mm.
around or during World War I.
Right.
So they were fortunate to arrive here, build incredible families, businesses, communities, um, which we didn't know a lot about. We didn't know almost anything about. But as I was COVID was setting in, and I was playing these recordings, and I said, "This is the time.
Yeah.
This is where I need to do this. Tell the story, connect it with sort of my own life's experiences." I never planned it to happen that way, but I'm very excited about it.
It's a really extraordinary story, and the kind of account of daily life, in Buchenwald is so, uh, it's so terrible and presented so kind of matter of factly because this was your grandfather's life with his father. Their efforts to stay together are quite poignant. And the other thing that also really I think makes this stand out even more is the way Alexander becomes involved in a sabotage plot to sabotage German munitions. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's pretty extraordinary, this small act of rebellion that really put all of their lives at even more risks than they were in already.
Yeah, I think that the parallel that I always used to draw in my mind is the kind of things you do at 17 or 18 you don't do when you're 40 or when
Yeah.
you're 50. Now I know it from the other side. Um, but it was very similar for me growing up at 18, going to the military and signing up for many, many years and doing things and taking risk that a person with a hindsight and the benefit of years would not necessarily do. So it's not coincidental that it was a 17-year-old person who was
Mhm.
in a unique situation, his life threatened, his father's life threatened, only wanted to go back and find his mom, get reunited with his family, getting an opportunity with a unique and incredible turn of events, being a center without telling too much of the story, having the advantage of getting unique prerogatives in a concentration camps or in a labor camp in an armament factory, having the ability to contribute and make a difference in a mass sabotage effort. It's not a coincidence that he was a 17-year-old and doing it. I think that
Mhm.
the courage and the initiative are a function of his youth, are a function of his youth, are a function of his unique situation and his passion to prevail and save his loved ones. Um, but after replaying these tapes, I did a lot of researching and I did a lot of reading, and there was a lot of sabotage work done by many brave people across occupied Europe and the Third Reich during the war. I think that there are numerous small stories. Some of them were told. Many of them, most of them, will never be told. They 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 died with their heroes. But I think that every opportunity that we have to bring to life these small stories of courage and how individuals made decisions that were not necessarily for their own benefit and were not maximizing benefit for themselves at that time in that particular place, but they still decided them to help the greater cause. We have
Mhm.
to tell these stories.
Mhm. When
It's,
sorry, go
no,
ahead,
go
Ray.
ahead, Sue. Yeah, it's. I'm actually really curious to know how what your grandfather. I mean, from what I gather, there's the kind of usual like hesitation to tell a story, yet his telling the story. So there's that kind of divide. How did he feel as you're writing the book and he understood that his story was going to be made this public?
So I started writing the book after he passed away.
I see.
We talked about it, especially in the last decade of his life. He, I mean, he going back further to my childhood, I learned very early that he built a very successful, like psychological separation apparatus that allowed him to be the entrepreneur, the happy person, and sort of hide this dark corner of his history, of his growing up in this chaotic situation. And he was he was extremely rational. He talked about the Holocaust in very sort of tangible and rational concepts and terms. I remember him when I was at third grade or fourth grade, inviting him to speak in front of my class, and he was telling that concentration camp story to 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds. So he always loved telling his story. But
Hmm.
when I was a teenager and I asked him, grandfather, this is something that we need to tell the world. It's a beautiful story, and you're the perfect storyteller. Every time you tell the story, there's another detail and there's some more color, and it's so incredible. And he would always say, that's not that interesting. I mean, there's so many. I mean, so many of us, millions of us. Most of us didn't survive that have these stories. My story is not that different. And I said, well, it doesn't really matter. All these stories are special and they all deserve to be told. And our responsibility is to make sure that they're not forgotten. I said, you can write a book someday. And he would always say that, and he wouldn't mean it. I didn't take it seriously. When I met him the last time, it was before COVID, and I said, you know that one day, I don't know when, and I don't make promises, but I want to tell your story. And he said, do whatever you want. I mean, it would be great if you do that. That was the first time he ever said that to me.
Nice.
But they were not. It's not going to be interesting for anybody. I said, you'll see. So I think that if he were here, I think he would be excited and happy
Hmm.
to hear people go to him and ask him questions and engage him about his story.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Well, it is so interesting. And I mean, it doesn't sound like everybody's story because so much was unique to him. And he has this talent for working with like metals or materials, and he ends up working on typewriters. There's a section of the book where he discovers a trove of chocolate bars, Nestle chocolate bars. Um, and he uses those to great effect to bribe the right people to get out. And you get, I thought, like that section, you get a sense of how desperate everybody is for this little for a chocolate bar, what can be traded for it. But again, you're seeing somebody
it's
who's
very
really
visual, right? It's like
yeah,
I mean, since childhood, I dream of Buchenwald in black and white, and
Yeah.
then you see this chocolate bar in red coming out of a pocket or
yeah.
a prisoner's suit. It was always so. I mean, the dissonance there was so evident.
Well, the descriptions are so vivid of him kind of flashing the chocolate bar to a guard and saying, you can have this if you tell me where my dad is. It, there's so much that is just exceptional about that story, and in a way, given the grimness of the environment, there was that surprising amount of kind of lightness and you go guy, like it was not, it was like it's a terrible, terrible story. And yet I think you've succeeded in telling it in a way that, does not leave the reader in total despair, just because you are really impressed with the tenacity and of this young man.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, first and foremost, I wanted to tell the story as if he had told it, and I
Mhm.
also like chose to tell it as if he was telling the story. So
Hmm.
taking me back to third grade and our
Hmm.
Friday afternoons in his big bed, this is how he would tell the story. No emotion, using his cynical sense of humor, like completely disconnecting from the trauma. And that's also my style. So in that sense, we're very similar. And I intentionally and purposely wanted to write a Holocaust memoir that is personal, that is accessible.
Right.
I read so many
Mhm.
Holocaust books that are just too much to bear, and they're important. And some people can, and some people can't, and some people take longer. Some keep people. I wanted to create as wide an audience as possible and tell a story that is a common story. I mean, there's so many similar stories about like that deterioration, that sort
Mhm.
of the slippery slope toward like fascism and the loss of personal freedoms and property. And I wanted to tell it in a way that people just wouldn't just put it aside and say that's too much. I don't need this right now. So
Mhm.
that was purposely the effort. And also, and again, I'm not American. English is not my first language. It was very important for me to tell this story for younger generations here. And my daughter, who's 14 now, who's exceptionally talented in her language skills, she was the only person who read the manuscript as I was writing it, and she was helping me edit and add from her language,
I love that.
and and I wanted to make she's American, and I wanted to make sure that this is a book that a junior or senior at high
Mhm.
school can pick up
Mhm.
and not be overwhelmed and not be scared and not be terrorized in reading. And by the way, last night we were playing poker with friends, and one of their kids was there, and he's reading the book. And for the first time, I heard someone say, "Well, this is not easy reading." And again, for me, interacting only with mature readers, older readers, over the last few weeks since it went out, they all complimented me for like making it sort of in in in
Accessible.
reasonable
Yeah.
bites and accessible, etc. And he said, "Well, I'm in chapter 4, but I needed a day or two. I needed to reflect on
Mhm.
what I've been reading, and they're at camp and they're freezing at night. It's a lot. I need to gather my thoughts, and I'm going to resume it tomorrow." So it's obviously all in the eyes of the beholder, and I've been living this the whole life. I'm inside the forest, so for me, it's really useful to take a step back and hear what people think.
Mhm. Well, that's interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts on, because you mentioned Holocaust memoirs, on the genre of Holocaust memoirs. Um, it's something I think about a lot, especially. I mean, there are a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of really great memoirs out there, a lot of really difficult ones. I, what happens to this like canon of books when the survivors are gone? Like what is, I mean, is this the last testament? Like what is the value that you think this will bring to future generations?
What an amazing question. I have to start this by paying tribute and giving thanks to an amazing lady, Elizabeth Hank, Amsterdam-based, who owns Amsterdam Publishers.
Mhm.
Without her, this book would not be published, and she has made it her um, life goal to bring to life second, third generation stories, and she's been doing it in um, very large volume of incredible stories over the last
Mhm.
few years. So anyone who liked this story, I invite them to look up Amsterdam Publishers and the other amazing books that she's been publishing. And I think that this is not coincidental in the sense that I believe that the third generation of survivors is going to play a huge role in figuring out how the Holocaust is going to be remembered, how it's going to be taught, how it's going to be shared and brokered to younger generations. I think that the first generation, most of the survivors I'd known in my life,
Mhm.
have been too traumatized and terrorized to have a discussion or to confront the world and share their stories and their thoughts about their lives. I mean, their life was ruined. Some of them managed to live a pseudo normal life, others not at all. Second generation sort of absorbed all of that wrath and complications, and I think that in many ways the third generation is the first generation that's close enough and yet detached enough to be able to tell the stories in a way that would um, bring people around the story and around the era and enable us to make it more in the consensus, more in the realm of acceptance, versus, and again, remembering my perspective as a third generation, it was so painful when it was between the first and the second generation at a family level. I can only imagine what it was in the realm of literature, and
Mhm.
I've not read a fraction of what was written. But just based on what I've seen in the last year, and based on sort of my perspective, and based on the discussions I've been having with friends who are not Jewish, who didn't know anything about the Holocaust, and my ability to talk about it in a way that is connected emotionally, but
Mhm.
disconnected enough to talk about this in a historical context, in a modern context, and why it's relevant today, and why when we talk about social justice in America today, and sort of why is it so intertwined, and why are we talking about the same things, and why this is all
Yeah.
part of one discussion. I think that the third generation is going to play a huge role in this, and
Mhm.
in the coming years.
I think you're right. Actually, I think there is a shift, and there's a lot of responsibility on this third generation, because this is a generation where we will have the last of the survivors around. So it's quite the weight to bear as well.
Yeah, and I think that the Apprentice of Buchenwald book really would, when you mention students and so on, it just puts such a human face on the entire enterprise. It just makes it so vividly horrific to see you talk about the organization, the way people have to line up, and then everyone's data is written on a different index card, and how much organization there was. And I almost feel like young people should be reading this book just for the just to get this visceral sense of the mundane nature of the evil that's being inflicted there, because I just don't think it's so hard to grasp it. Were you very conscious that you were writing in kind of details about these interactions that Alexander had with the Germans who were running the camp, how you wanted to present those?
Yeah, again, he was very detached emotionally when he shared all of these interactions with them. And when we talked about it, and when I asked him, well, were these monsters, or were these real people? I mean, I'm reading history at school, I'm hearing your stories. And he said, well, it's as a child to me, well, it's more complicated than that, right? And only today, when you look at politics and what's happening all around you, you understand that it's it's very difficult to use a dichotomy of good versus bad, and monsters and good people. And he part of the uniqueness of this story is that he comes from an affluent background, upper middle class, where they saw German culture as the Uber culture, as sort of where literature, music, fashion, it was all, I mean, the German culture, I mean, gave the cues to all the nations around. And so for him, it was very difficult, even in hindsight, even decades after the events at the camp and the Holocaust. His go-to place was Germany. It was Austria. It was Switzerland. His preferred communication method was in German. He wanted to go there. He wanted to spend time at the casino in Baden-Baden and like walk the streets of Frankfurt and have a nice meal. So he sort of blocked out that period, and he was never vindictive in any way against the German people. He basically compartmentalized that period and said it was a terrible time where mankind, Germans, Italians, and others just went to places they should not have gone to, and there's a complex explanation of why that happened. And there were terrible people, but there were good people, and I've met terrible people, but I've met great people. Um, and I can only assume, because it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of a Holocaust survivor. That's sort of a survival mechanism, because you have to, and he's the ultimate optimist. You have to believe in the good nature of people to continue, right? If you thought that it was all bad around you, it's very very difficult to raise generations of optimists after you. So yeah.
I'm sorry, so many questions, and I am conscious of time. Tell us, I mean, in addition to the interview, tell us a bit about your research. Like, how did you, you mentioned you had a friend, you did a DNA test, or I don't know which company you used, and what kind of touring, and what tools did you use to get the story the way it is?
So my grandfather had some basic information about his uncles and his great uncles, and he shared some of it, and some of it came in like incredible ways. His one of his second cousins was the chief rabbi of the U.S. Army during World War II, and when they survived the camps and were figuring out what's going to happen, then that Rabbi Rosenberg from the Allied sort of Central Command went down and met them and asked them whether they wanted to join the family in the States. And but they sort of hadn't made up their mind, and eventually the course of events was such that they found themselves in Israel fighting the War of Independence a few months later. Um, so I had some bits and bytes and anecdotes about family members, but no one was able to draw um, that family tree. And so I started from these bits and bytes, and I didn't know anything about genealogy. That was nothing.
Mhm.
No one in Israel did anything with that, and there were new emerging platforms. And I started working with MyHeritage that had very basic databases at the time. But as they were increasing their access to statistical and historical census data here in the States, I started connecting these bits and bytes, and I started sort of drawing these lines from Czechoslovakia to Cleveland, Ohio, to LA, to Yonkers, sort of finding the people, reaching out to them, introducing myself, um, hearing amazing stories that we've not known, maybe because my grandparents didn't know or didn't know all, or they just opted to focus on sort of our life there, and
Mhm.
just life was too busy and too hectic, and things just got lost with history.
Hmm.
But it was eye opening for us again, growing up in the beautiful place and where we were raised, not knowing about the beautiful communities and Jewish life that's happening across the sea by people who come from the same family, look like us, sound like us, and have so much in common, but we've never met.
Hmm.
So it was really eye opening for me, for us, and I've met with incredible family members, and we found these incredible letters and correspondence dating 100 or 80 years back, where
Wow.
my great grandfather and their great grandfather like talk about how they love each other and how they support each
Wow.
other and how they. I mean, it's pretty incredible, and I think that to me that gave a much deeper dimension to the whole family story in the small town. And so why is my great grandfather the one that stayed behind while they left? So why
Mhm.
would young people, I mean, leave this affluent family and take this long ship ride, go to Ellis
Yeah.
Island, and what made them do that? And how different were they? Were they secular? Were they
Right.
Orthodox? I mean, were they highly educated? Did they go to school? So all of these mundane details that are really important to understand the context of these decisions, we had no idea. So as you learn, you
Hmm.
understand. Well, your great grandfather was the trader. He's like the person that got sort of the family business. The others were, they went to school. They had other opportunities. They It was really eye opening. It was
That's
wonderful.
wow. It's
Yeah.
amazing. Have you done a DNA test then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, pretty 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 frightening, but obviously very useful for that genealogy project.
Yeah.
We got connected to people that, again, we didn't know existed, and
Hmm.
we're now placing them. It's so funny. We just saw Leopoldstadt here on Broadway a
Yeah.
week ago. What a wonderful play! But as I mentioned to my wife, and then my daughter, who also went with her school to watch it, it felt like a Friday dinner at our house, and talking about the aunts and the uncles, and the one that stayed behind in the
Hmm.
death camps, and the one that remained, and the ones that were secular, and the ones that were converted, and the one that, I mean, there, so many. I mean, it felt so familiar.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can see that. Wow. Sue, any more questions for Oren, our special guest?
No, just would you say you're someone who wrote a book but not an author, but would you consider future books?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I have more ideas for books, but it feels different because to me this doesn't feel like my book. It feels
Right.
like something I did, sort of an escrow,
Right.
for
That's
someone
interesting.
who's very
Yeah.
dear to me. I
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
loved writing,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
I wish for myself that I have the time to immerse myself in developing more ideas.
Sure.
So never say never,
Never say
but I
never.
don't know.
Great.
Well,
Right.
Thank you so much, Oren. This has been just delightful. Once again, The Apprentice of Buchenwald. You can buy it, and we will, when we promote this, we'll send out links. But buy the book and read Oren's fabulous story of his grandfather. Thank you, Oren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Susan. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. Thanks again. Until next week, everyone. See you later.